The Wyoming wind cut through Ruth Caldwell's worn coat like 1,000 knives, each gust carrying the bitter promise of another unforgiving winter. She pulled the fabric tighter around her shoulders, but it did little against the October cold that had already settled deep into the bones of the land. The endless prairie stretched before her, golden and gray beneath a sky the color of old pewter. Somewhere beyond those rolling hills lay her last hope for survival. Ruth had been walking for 3 days since leaving the last homestead that turned her away. Got no need for another mouth to feed, the rancher's wife had said, not cruelly, but with the weary firmness of someone who had seen too many lean winters. Ruth couldn't blame her. Times were hard for everyone in 1886, but they were hardest of all for a woman alone. The memory of why she was alone followed her like a shadow. The fever had swept through their small settlement outside Philadelphia, stealing her family one by one. Her brother Samuel, her mother, and finally her father, gone within weeks. Ruth had survived. Sometimes she wondered if that was a blessing or a curse. By the time she reached Cedar Ridge, the sun was already sinking behind the distant mountains. The town wasn't much. A cluster of weathered buildings huddled together as if for warmth. A general store, a saloon with faint piano music drifting from its doors, a sheriff's office with a single horse tied outside. The mud on the street was half frozen, the air sharp enough to sting her lungs. Ruth straightened her spine and smoothed her dark hair, trying to make herself look presentable. Her dress, once blue, was faded to gray, but it was clean. Her boots were worn thin, her hands cracked from cold, but her spirit still held. The general store seemed the best place to start. A bell jingled overhead as she stepped inside. Warmth from a pot-bellied stove wrapped around her like a blanket. The shopkeeper, a thin man with spectacles, looked up from his ledger. "Help you, miss?" "I'm looking for work," Ruth said, her voice steady. "Cooking, cleaning, mending. I can do it all." The man's eyes softened, but he shook his head. "Times are lean. My wife keeps house. But," he paused, stroking his whiskers, "you might try the Morrison Ranch. Caleb Morrison's been looking for help since his cook ran off." "Where is it?" Quote, 15 miles north, then west along Willow Creek. "But miss," he lowered his voice, "Morrison's not an easy man. Keeps to himself. There's talk about what happened to his wife." Ruth lifted her chin. "I'm not afraid of hard work or difficult people." The man sighed. "Old Pete's hauling supplies out that way. Might take you part of the road, but he won't go near Morrison's place. Nobody does." Ruth thanked him and hurried out back, where a grizzled man was loading sacks of flour onto a wagon. Pete eyed her with suspicion at first, but finally nodded. "You can ride as far as the turnoff. After that, it's on foot." As they rattled out of town, Ruth stared at the frozen horizon. What kind of man is Caleb Morrison? Pete spat over the side. "The kind who's lost too much. His wife died 3 years ago. Comanche raid, they said. Some folks whisper otherwise. Either way, he's been half-ghost since." The wagon jolted over the rutted trail and Ruth held tighter to her shawl. When they finally reached the narrow track leading west, the sun was dipping low, painting the prairie gold and crimson. "This is as far as I go," Pete said, pulling the mules to a stop. He reached under the seat and handed her a battered lantern. "Moon won't rise for hours yet. You'll need this." "Thank you," Ruth said, her voice catching. He nodded once. "You seem a good soul. Don't lose it out here." Then he was gone, the wagon creaking away into the dusk. Ruth walked. The wind howled across the open land, tugging at her skirts. The lantern threw a small pool of light ahead, surrounded by vast darkness. Somewhere, a coyote yipped, and she clutched the handle tighter. Her boots sank into the frozen ground, and each step sent pain shooting up her legs. Just when she thought she couldn't go on, a faint light appeared ahead, the glow of windows. The Morrison Ranch lay in a shallow valley, the 2-story house solid and stark against the prairie. Smoke curled from the chimney. Ruth stopped at the gate, the wooden crossbar branded with a circle M. For a moment she hesitated. Then, gathering what courage she had left, she lifted the latch and walked through. The front door opened before she reached the steps. A tall figure stood framed in the warm light. Broad shoulders, lean frame, a shadowed face beneath a wide-brimmed hat. "You're on private property," the man said, his voice low and rough. "Turn around and go back." Ruth lifted her lantern. "Mr. Morrison, I heard in town you might need a cook." He studied her for a long moment, the wind tugging at his coat. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter but no softer. "You walked from Cedar Ridge?" "Partway. A wagon gave me a ride." He stepped down from the porch, and the lantern light caught his face. He was perhaps 35, with dark hair and pale gray eyes that looked like they'd seen too much. "Can you actually cook?" "I've been cooking since I was 12. I can make bread from scratch, butcher a chicken, preserve meat, and stretch rations to last through a hard month." He seemed to measure her words, then nodded once. "Where's your family?" "Dead," Ruth said simply. Something flickered across his face, maybe recognition of shared loss. "You have references?" "No, sir, but I'll work a week for just room and board. If you don't like my cooking, I'll go without complaint." The wind gusted, and she shivered. Morrison frowned, then turned toward the door. "Come inside. We'll talk where it's warm." The warmth of the fire hit her like a wave as she stepped inside. The house was clean but bare, built for work, not comfort. Morrison handed her a cup of strong coffee. "Room and board plus $20 a month," he said. "3 meals a day, laundry once a week, nothing else. I don't need company or conversation, just meals on time. Clear?" "Yes, Mr. Morrison." "Good. Your room's upstairs. Breakfast at 5, dinner at noon, supper at 6. Don't be late." He took his coat and hat and left without another word. Ruth sat for a moment by the fire, thawing her frozen hands. Then she rose and explored the kitchen. It was well stocked but plain. Flour, beans, pork, coffee, salt. Enough to work with. Upstairs, she found her small room. A clean bed, a washstand, a window facing the dark prairie. Someone, perhaps Morrison himself, had already laid a fire in the hearth. As she unpacked her few things, Ruth listened to the wind howling outside. It sounded wild and lonely, like the land itself. But here, at least for tonight, she had warmth, shelter, and work. She glanced toward the window, where the lantern light from the barn still flickered. Caleb Morrison was a hard man, that much was clear, but Ruth sensed something else behind those gray eyes, a loneliness that matched her own. She lay down, exhaustion claiming her. As she drifted to sleep, she wondered what story lay buried beneath the walls of this quiet, haunted house, and what kind of man had built it out here at the edge of nowhere. Ruth woke before dawn to the sound of wind rattling the window panes. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then the events of the night before came flooding back. The long walk, the hard-eyed rancher, the unexpected warmth of a fire. She dressed quickly, her breath fogging in the cold air, and made her way downstairs. The kitchen was dark and silent, the stove cold. She lit the lamp, then stepped outside for wood. The pre-dawn sky was ink black, and the ground crunched under her boots. Somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed, and horses stamped in the barn. By the time she had the fire roaring, water boiling, and bacon sizzling, the first gray light of morning had crept through the windows. She found flour and lard, kneaded dough for biscuits, and set them to bake. The rhythm of cooking, the familiar comfort of it, steadied her nerves. The door opened, and Caleb Morrison stepped in from the cold. He looked every bit the rancher she had imagined. Tall, broad-shouldered, weathered by sun and wind. His gray eyes flicked to the stove, to the neatly set table, then to her. "Morning, Mr. Morrison," Ruth said quietly. He nodded once and took his seat. He didn't speak again as she poured his coffee and set his plate before him. Bacon crisp, eggs perfectly fried, biscuits golden brown. He ate with the focus of a man who viewed meals as necessary, not pleasurable. When he finally looked up, his expression softened, just slightly. "These'll do." Ruth almost smiled. For a man like him, that was high praise. After breakfast, he pulled on his gloves and hat. "I'll be in the north pasture. Dinner at noon sharp." When the door closed behind him, Ruth exhaled the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She cleaned the kitchen, then explored her new domain. The pantry was well stocked but plain. Beans, salt pork, coffee, flour, dried apples. Enough to survive, but nothing to bring joy. Out back, she discovered a small garden, half choked with weeds but not yet dead. Potatoes, onions, and turnips clung stubbornly to life. She knelt in the dirt and began clearing it, her hands moving with purpose. The sun climbed higher, warming the frozen ground. For the first time in months, Ruth found herself humming softly as she worked. She didn't notice Morrison watching from the barn door, his face unreadable. The sound of her quiet humming, light and human in this lonely place, lingered long after he turned away. At noon, he returned, just as she had expected. The smell of venison stew filled the kitchen, seasoned with wild herbs Ruth had found near the fence line. She served him quietly, waiting as he took the first bite. His brows lifted slightly. "Smells different," he said. "I use thyme and sage," she replied. "It's how my mother cooked stew back home." He nodded once, then ate in silence, finishing the bowl. "You can keep doing it that way." Ruth took that as permission to stay. Days passed in a rhythm that slowly became familiar. Ruth rose before dawn, cooked his meals, washed clothes, and kept the fires burning. Caleb spoke little, but she learned his habits. He preferred strong coffee, rare steak, and silence. He came in from the fields at dusk, his face lined with exhaustion, and ate like a man who didn't expect kindness from life. At night, Ruth would sit by the fire after he retired, mending clothes or reading from the few tattered books on the shelf. Sometimes she heard him moving in his room above, pacing, muttering. Once, she thought she heard him say a woman's name, Sarah. She guessed it was his wife. One evening, as she ladled stew into bowls, Caleb spoke suddenly. "You're not what I expected." Ruth froze, the ladle halfway to the pot. "Sir?" "Most women who come out here are looking for a husband, or an easy life." His voice was low, thoughtful. "You don't scare easy." "I've had worse than the Wyoming wind," Ruth said. He looked at her for a long time. "Where did you say you were from?" "Philadelphia, but that life is gone. This is home now." Something flickered in his eyes, a kind of understanding, or maybe longing. "The garden looks good," he said after a moment, almost awkwardly. Ruth smiled faintly. "Thank you. With care, we'll have fresh vegetables by spring." Quote. That night she woke to the sound of his voice again, low, broken. She crept to the top of the stairs and listened. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he murmured. "God, I'm so sorry." Her heart twisted. She didn't know what haunted him, but it was deep and heavy. In the morning he looked worn, his eyes shadowed. Ruth said nothing, only poured his coffee stronger and added an extra biscuit to his plate. He didn't thank her, but when he left, his voice was softer. "Good breakfast." By afternoon, the air had turned sharp and cold again. Ruth was kneading dough when she heard horses outside. More than one. She glanced through the window. 3 men rode up fast, dust and frost kicking from their boots as they dismounted. Something about them, the way they moved, the glint of metal under their coats, made her uneasy. A heavy fist pounded on the door. "Morrison! We know you're in there." Ruth hesitated, then wiped her hands and went to the door. "Mr. Morrison isn't here," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. The man in front wore a tarnished badge and a cruel smirk. "You his new woman?" he drawled. "Best be careful, miss. Ask him what happened to the last one." Ruth's jaw tightened. "I'm his cook. What's your business here?" "Sheriff's business?" The man lied easily. "He's been rustling cattle again. We're here to check his stock." Before she could respond, a deep voice cut through the cold. "That's enough, Daniels." Caleb sat his horse at the gate, rifle resting across his saddle, the setting sun turning him into a shadow of steel and flame. "Caleb," Daniels sneered, "just having a friendly talk with your cook." "You're trespassing," Caleb said flatly. "You and your hired guns can turn around and ride out." "Daniels," fake badge glinted, "you think you're untouchable, Morrison?" "The Cattlemen's Association doesn't forget." "I don't answer to thieves," Caleb said, his tone deadly calm. Daniels spat in the dirt. "You'll regret crossing us." Ask your wife what's standing up to us got her." Ruth saw Caleb's hands tighten on the rifle. "You've said enough," he warned. The men backed their horses, but Daniels pointed a gloved finger at Ruth. "You'd best ask him about Sarah before you get too comfortable." They rode off, laughter echoing in the cold air. Caleb dismounted slowly, his jaw tight. Ruth's hands were trembling when he stepped into the kitchen. "You stood up for me," he said quietly. "Why?" "Because those men weren't lawmen, and because you've been fair." He nodded once. "They're association dogs. Been after me for years." She poured him coffee, her hand brushing his as she passed the cup. "They said things about your wife." His face went hard. "They say I killed her." Ruth froze. "Did you?" He met her gaze, and the pain in his eyes was worse than anger. "No, but I might as well have." Before she could speak, he turned and walked out into the darkening yard, leaving her alone with questions that burned like the fire behind her. As the wind howled outside and the first flakes of snow began to fall, Ruth realized the truth about Caleb Morrison. The man who'd hired her to cook was haunted by more than loss. He was a man carrying a secret, heavy enough to crush him. And whether she wanted to or not, she was already part of it. The blizzard came without warning. By afternoon, the sky turned a strange yellow-gray, and the air felt heavy, charged. Ruth had never seen a Wyoming storm, but the silence before it fell made her skin prickle. Caleb had ridden out early to check the north herd. She'd begged him to wait until morning, but he'd only shaken his head. "They'll freeze if I don't move them to shelter." By sunset, snow was falling in thick, blinding sheets. The world outside the window disappeared into a white wall. Ruth kept the fire blazing, a pot of stew simmering on the stove. She tried not to watch the clock, but as the hours dragged on and night closed in, dread crawled up her spine. When the door finally burst open, she spun around with a cry. Caleb stumbled inside, half frozen, his beard and coat covered in ice. "Caleb!" she gasped, rushing to him. His lips were blue, his hands shaking violently. He collapsed to his knees. "Can't feel my feet," he rasped. Ruth's heart pounded. "Frostbite. We need to warm you slowly. Don't move." She dragged him to a chair by the stove and began pulling off his boots. His feet were ghostly white, his fingers stiff. She filled a basin with cool water, dipping cloths and wrapping his hands and toes. He gritted his teeth against the pain, eyes fixed on hers. "How long were you out there?" she asked, voice trembling. "Lost the trail when the storm hit." Horse bolted. "I walked," followed the fence line. "You're lucky you made it home." "Maybe," he said through clenched teeth, "or maybe I just couldn't stay away." Her eyes met his, and something passed between them, something neither had the courage to name. "Your clothes are soaked. You'll freeze again if you stay in them." "I can manage," he muttered, trying to stand, but his legs gave out. Without thinking, Ruth slid under his arm, bracing him. He leaned heavily against her as she guided him upstairs to his room, a space she'd never entered before. The scent of leather and smoke clung to everything. A single photo sat on the dresser, a blonde woman smiling softly. "Sarah, I'll get you soup and blankets," Ruth said quickly, trying not to stare. When she returned, he was in bed, his face pale, eyes half closed. She spooned broth to his lips. "Drink," she said gently. He obeyed, watching her over the rim of the cup. "You saved my life." "You saved yourself by coming home." "No," he said quietly. "You saved me the night you walked through that gate." Her cheeks flushed. "You should rest." He reached for her hand before she could move away. His fingers were rough, trembling. "Ruth." She froze. It was the first time he'd said her name. "Thank you," he whispered, his thumb brushing her palm. Then he let go. She fled the room, her pulse racing. Downstairs, she sank into a chair by the fire, heart pounding as she replayed the moment. Something had shifted, something that could not be undone. The storm raged for 2 days. Caleb's fever broke by the second night, and Ruth stayed near his side, tending the fire, changing his bandages, reading aloud from the old books on his shelf. He talked sometimes in half dreams, about Sarah, about guilt, about the association that had taken everything from him. When he finally woke clear-eyed, the storm had passed. Pale sunlight streamed through the window. How long was I out? Quote, 2 days. He studied her face. You look exhausted. I've had worse. She smiled faintly. And I'm still here. That evening, as she helped him sit up to eat, he said quietly, They said I killed her. Ruth set down the bowl. Your wife? He nodded. 3 years ago. She rode to town alone while I was working the southern pasture. The association wanted to break me. Burned out 2 of my neighbors already. I told her to stay close, but she went anyway. They ambushed her on the road. I should have gone with her. Ruth reached out without thinking, placing her hand over his. That wasn't your fault. His gaze met hers. Maybe not, but I might have stopped it. You can't live your life chained to ghosts, Caleb. He looked at her for a long moment, then said softly, You remind me of her sometimes. Not in looks. In spirit, the way you fight the cold, the way you hum when you work. Her throat tightened. You hired me to cook, nothing more. I lied. The words hung between them. Ruth stood abruptly. You need rest. But as she turned to leave, his voice stopped her. You terrify me, he said quietly, because you make me feel alive again. She froze, unable to speak. I swore I'd never love again, he continued. But God help me, Ruth, I want much more than your cooking. Her heart hammered so loudly she thought he could hear it. Caleb. He reached for her hand again, his grip warm and desperate. I know it's wrong. I know what people would say. But when I look at you, the silence in this house disappears. Ruth's voice was barely a whisper. And if we lose everything again? Then we start over. Together. She leaned in, her forehead resting against his. You stubborn, foolish man. He smiled for the first time she'd ever seen. That's what it takes to survive in Wyoming. She kissed him then, softly, like a promise. But promises were fragile things in the West. 3 nights later, the attack came. Ruth woke to the sound of breaking glass and men's voices shouting outside. The air smelled of smoke. She grabbed the Colt revolver Caleb had given her and ran to the window. The barn was already on fire, flames leaping high into the night. Caleb! She screamed. He was already downstairs, rifle in hand. Stay inside! I'm not hiding! Bullets shattered the front window, glass spraying across the floor. Ruth ducked and fired through the smoke. A man outside cried out. Morrison! A voice roared. Come on out! Time to pay your debts! Caleb fired back from the porch, his rifle cracking like thunder. You picked the wrong night! Ruth joined him, reloading with trembling hands. The attackers circled the house, their torches lighting the snow red and gold. Root cellar! Caleb shouted. They ran together through the kitchen as bullets tore into the walls. Caleb shoved open the trap door, pulling Ruth down behind him just as fire began to lick at the roof. The cellar was pitch dark. They huddled close, the earth trembling above them. They'll burn it all, Ruth whispered, shaking. Let them, Caleb said fiercely, his arms wrapping around her. We'll build again. We always will. His voice broke, and before she could stop herself, she kissed him. This time not gentle, but fierce and desperate, like 2 souls clinging to life itself. When dawn came, the world above was quiet. Smoke curled from the blackened remains of the house. The barn was gone, the field scarred. But they were alive. Caleb climbed out first, then helped her up. They stood together, breath visible in the cold air, surrounded by ruin. They wanted to break us, Ruth said softly. They failed, he answered. He turned to her then, eyes filled with something deep and certain. Ruth Caldwell, he said, voice rough with emotion, will you marry me? Her heart stopped. What? I almost lost you last night. I don't want to face another sunrise without knowing you're mine. She looked at the burned house, the gray sky, the man standing before her with ash on his face and hope in his eyes. Then she nodded. Yes, quote. He smiled, that rare, beautiful smile, and pulled her into his arms. Then let's rebuild, Mrs. Morrison. And together, amid the ashes, they began again.